Rosa. Thank you for your time today to give us an interview and share a bit of your experience and knowledge of your work on anti-Semitism and racism, especially working with young people. And we are very appreciative that you have the time to give us an interview. So maybe we can start with the first question. So in Germany, especially, many schools use excursions to former Nazi concentration camps in their history curricula. And maybe could you tell us something about the teachers' pedagogical goals for these visits? And how do students typically react to these visits, you reckon?
I think there are two main reasons why teachers include a visit to the site of a former concentration camp. One is that they want the students to see with their own eyes. This is a strong topos, to see something with your own eyes, to make your own experience on a so-called authentic place. Of course, everybody knows after 70 years, nothing is like it used to be. And at some places, there aren't even any barracks or something much left of what was there in the Nazi times, but there is another kind of authenticity because of the materiality of the place, and that is a very important experience. Another reason is that most teachers don't have expert knowledge or detailed knowledge on National Socialism and all the backgrounds you need to know. And so they like to visit such a place where the students get to talk to an expert, which is also a kind of method to learn, that you learn from experts and can get into discourse with them. Then there is perhaps a third reason, like an introduction into commemorating, because when you visit such a place, there is also a kind of commemorating the victims, because the sites of the former concentration camps always have a site which is more like a monument to the victims. And so it is a strange mixture of combining learning and commemorating all at once. And then what is also perhaps an underlying reason for visiting the site of a former concentration camp is that the picture, the image of National Socialism and its crimes, especially the killing of the Jews, is connected to the image of Auschwitz as one of the main or the biggest extermination camp, which was also a labor camp. And so in public, or let's say in common imaginary of National Socialism, you think that a concentration camp was an extermination camp. And when you visit a place like Dachau or Neuengamme or Buchenwald or Rosen, also whatever, it is like a substitute for visiting the extermination camp of Auschwitz in Poland, because very few groups have the time and the money and all the resources to really do a trip to Auschwitz. And so it is like, I call it a substitute, because sometimes you can see it, that a group is prepared to a visit to, let's say, Dachau or Neuengamme by learning about the Holocaust, the killing of the Jews, but not of any other National Socialist crimes, and not the persecution, not learning about the persecution of the political opponents and many other groups which were persecuted by the Nazis, and they don't know this. And so sometimes there is a little bit of misunderstanding between a group and the guide, because at the beginning they have different things in mind, because there is no place of extermination like Auschwitz or the other extermination camps on German soil now. The reactions of the students are very different depending on how the visit is prepared, if it is something the pupils wanted to do on their own, if they had read a lot before, or if they haven't. Something I experience very often is that at the beginning, a group is quite reserved and the faces are all very closed. And the group is not in good humor because it's cold and they had to stand up very early to come to this place. They don't have something to eat. They don't have proper clothes. Often it's cold outside and there is a lot of wind. But after a while, when they get to hear what it is all about and what happened on the different places they visit on such a site, then they get very interested. Part of the group gets very interested. And mostly you have some individuals who are really very much interested because everything about National Socialism and Hitler is is part of popular culture or is part of everyday talk somehow. And so there are a lot of pupils who want to know what's behind all this and what really was a concentration camp.
Thank you. Like particular emotional power and authenticity has always been attributed to testimony by camp survivors. There are hardly any members of this generation still alive. And how does the death of the survivor generation and the fading of living memory affect the commemoration of the Holocaust and educational programs in former concentration camps specifically?
I don't think that everyday routine on the site of a former concentration camp on a memorial, at a memorial will change a lot because the everyday educational program works without survivors. You can't even manage to have a survivor, 15 survivors for 15 groups every day there. And so this question about the dying of the survivors of the Nazi crimes or of the last witnesses on the other side, this talk is about something else. What will change, of course, is special occasions like Commemoration Day, like the 27th of January, or other dates, the date, of course, of the liberation of a camp. Until now, you have a lot of survivors, but you also already have for years and decades, you have their children and their grandchildren. And so I think this question about not having an authentical voice anymore works more on a level of symbolic politics, policy, or on a level of representation, but not on this level of learning about the past. And you can see that this is not a natural connection. If you see that in these days, or for some years now, there is a lot of talk in Germany about its colonial past and about the crimes committed in Namibia, or former southwestern Africa. Or there is much more talk about the genocide of the Armenians. And everything works without survivors, so eyewitnesses, or the ones who committed the crimes. So you see that this massive talk, even for 2 or 3 decades now, about the dying of the survivors and other witnesses is not an education, or is not about learning. It is about very important other things. But we know enough of the past, and we have a lot of records of every kind to convey this history, like we can convey every other history, which is even thousands of years old.
Educators often seem to ascribe a kind of moral purpose to visits to former concentration camps. And what do you think? How can a site of crime against humanity have a moral effect on visitors?
How the visit of a site of crimes against humanity can have a moral effect on people, I don't know. That depends on the person and his or her individual background, and perhaps even religion or ideological affiliations and things like that. I cannot tell you how visit of a site can have a moral impact. When talking of a moral impact, I think what is mostly meant is that there is a kind of reduction of learning about the past for the future. And this learning is reduced to very simple things like this was bad, and now we have to do everything that this bad thing doesn't happen again, and that the bad thing doesn't start with a concentration camp, but it starts with words or with actions or with laws, whatever you put into that moral, you say, I don't know in English. So there is this critique, which I share, that it is the most important when visiting any site of a crime is that you really have to learn what really happened there in detail, and not that just something bad and a crime against humanity took place, but you have to learn about the ideological backgrounds, about how everything was organized, who did these crimes, and all with which is connected to this. And this reduction to moral learning is something for decades now, which students know that you imply that upon them, and which they resist in some kind or other. And this is quite good that they do, because they have to think for themselves. And in Germany, you can really see that from the 90s on, this moral about learning, this moral of learning about the National Socialist part was put into the goal the goal of being able to intervene militarily when somewhere it seems that crimes similar to those of National Socialism are committed. And so you see that this is a very simple kind of instrumentalization. And that's one reason why there is much critique upon this kind of learning from the past for the future. To be a good person, you don't need to visit a site of crimes against humanity to know that that your neighbor is equal to you, and you're not allowed to do any harm to him or her or anybody.
So across the globe, Germany is noted for its sustained efforts to come to terms with its past and for the development of deliberate and officially sanctioned culture of remembrance of Nazi crimes. What do you think? What is problematic about this kind of nationalization of commemoration?
I don't know if other countries should follow the German example of remembrance culture, but of course it would be very good if other countries would follow the example of acknowledging the crimes committed. Like if in Turkey it was acknowledged that there has been a genocide against of Armenians, or if Germany would apply its own lesson to itself to acknowledge that there has been a genocide of the Herero and Nama people in Namibia, or a lot of other crimes, and if it would pay compensations, return property, and everything which is connected are implied in such a kind of acknowledgement. What happened in Germany with this cultural approach, yes, with this remembrance culture, is perhaps that you can say there has been a kind of separation between these cultural events and what perhaps one could call, yeah, I don't know the term in English, eine echte Aufarbeitung, real kind of coming to terms on different levels with the crimes committed. And so in Germany, you can see from the 90s on that there has developed something like an identity, like a national identity, a positive national identity of having committed these crimes, having learned about them, and now being good and doing good things. And so some people even call it like a pride of Aufarbeitung, of dealing with the past. And this is expressed, of course, in different forms of culture, of remembrance culture. And this is very problematic because in this way, the killing of the Jews and of other groups, but mainly the talk is of the Jews, the killing of the Jews becomes the core of your identity in a positive way. And that's very strange. I only can call these things strange or grotesque. And this kind of positive recurrence on crimes is very problematic in different kinds, on different spheres. And so I would say, yes, it would be very good if other countries or Germany itself would follow the example and acknowledge different national crimes, but not to develop a kind of national identity from it. This perhaps is what I could call a nationalization of remembrance culture. And if you ask what's problematic about it, perhaps there are two levels. One level is that it is very superficial, and you can see from a lot of experiences you can make every day that underneath this facade, there is a lot of hatred and anti-Semitism and resentment about the past. And yes, the other thing I tried to explain, you cannot build your identity on the extermination of someone else.
Given the multi-ethnic composition of today's schools, educators often argue that we need new approaches to teaching about the Nazi period that allow for a more inclusive way of teaching German history. And do you know any of these new methods, and what do you think? Do you think they're successful?
I don't know what these new methods are and if they are implied at all. If you say one method of learning about National Socialism is visiting the site of a former concentration camp, then you don't need to change that, because for decades now, some of your pupils or the whole class are pupils whose parents or grandparents are not from Germany. And I don't know why visiting the site of a former concentration camp or reading Anne Frank, the Diary of Anne Frank, is exclusive. You can only exclude yourself from the things you have to learn. And if you exclude yourself from a topic which you consider to be too German, then I ask myself, how nationalist are you? Imagine vice versa, you move to a different country, let's say South Africa or Turkey, and you say you don't like that your children have to learn about apartheid and racism or about the Armenian genocide, if there was learning about the genocide of the Armenians in Turkey, because that's not the history of your children. And that is what the discourse here in Germany is about, to say children of immigrants don't have this Nazi past as their history, which isn't even right, because as everybody knows, the Nazi Germany occupied almost the whole of Europe and took the whole world into a world war. So on a certain kind, these crimes and this past is like the past of everybody. And new methods, I don't really know if there are any at schools. Sometimes in discourse it is said you should read about Turkish Jews in the Holocaust. So this would imply your immigrant children should not read the diary of Anne Frank, but should read some text about a Turkish Jew who was or whose family was persecuted during the Holocaust. There are such stories, there is this history, but perhaps you can think for yourself how you can do that practically. If you have to count when you have 26 pupils, who has parents or grandparents from which country, and do I need 26 different diaries or what? You see, I cannot really talk very constructive, do I say in English, about this topic, because I think that all the assumptions made are so wrong that I really can only answer ironically to that and say that I'm really glad that all my teachers let me learn about German history and also about French Revolution and Russian Revolution, although my parents weren't French or Russian or German or Greek, and I had to learn about Greek antiquity.
Following up on the last question, for example, some educators also argue that we need to broaden the range of topics. History curricula should include topics like the Armenian genocide and human rights education, for example. What do they mean to achieve by this, you think? And do you reckon this is a good way of adapting Holocaust education to a migrant society like Germany?
Everybody wants to broaden the topics you have to learn in history at school, but nobody tells us how many years the students are supposed to go to school to learn about all the topics which are not part of the curriculum so far. And I think this question should be taken very seriously and discussed with experts of didactics and those experts who know how to reduce many thousand years of human history all over the globe to those few hours you have at school. And that taking into account that you also want to change the methods of learning, you want to change approaches like having gender history, which is not just putting some women here and there. You want to talk about environmental history. So there is really a lot which has to change. And I think that sometimes the discussions about, because of having migrant kids in German schools, you have to include the history of the migrants. Then what is the history of what migrants? I think this question of how to have a curriculum of history which is suitable for the problems of our days is there is much, much more behind it than putting whatever comes to your mind, how important it may be on the curriculum. Some say you have to combine in some way or other learning about National Socialism with other genocides. Some say you have to combine it with a history of Israel. Some say something different. You have to talk about German colonialism. And I think these questions need really much more thinking, not just from one topic, But really, this problem, which I stated, you have many thousand years of human history on the whole globe, and that has to be put into a few years and very few hours of history during a school year.
With the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees in Germany in especially 2015, 2016, some educators proposed that young refugees should make obligatory visits to concentration camp memorial sites as a means of countering anti-Semitism and raising awareness about Nazi crimes. What do you think about this? How would you evaluate this?
These ideas to make refugees from Syria or other places visit the sites of former concentration camps is one of the ideas deriving from things I told you before, that you go to a site to learn bad crimes happened here, and we learn from them, and we know now that we don't do them again. Yeah, this Holocaust education, as it's sometimes called. And here, the reason was that with some of the refugees from Syria or Afghanistan or other countries, it was said that they bring anti-Semitism to Germany. And so, like the Germans, they have to learn what the Germans did, go to a site of the crimes and learn from it and abolish their anti-Semitism. And as I said before, there are a lot of problems of this approach anyway. And considering the special group, there were some people like me who really got like angry about this, because you only talked about these persons as a problem and as bringing a problem to Germany, which is a very German problem, anti-Semitism, and you don't take into consideration their everyday living conditions as refugees in Germany. They had still a lot of these refugees have substandard living standards and don't know what their future will be, if they can stay here for how many years, if they have to go back immediately, if there is perhaps some treaty made in, let's say, 1 year, if it was possible in Syria. And so this is a very instrumental approach on this group, just again to state, like we in Germany, we are free of anti-Semitism. Only in some right-wing groups there is anti-Semitism, but then the migrants bring anti-Semitism to Germany. And of course, in Syria or in other countries, you have this hostility against Israel. And of course, it is very much mixed up with anti-Semitism. But then it would be the real, or a good practice would be to give these people the opportunities to learn together with the Germans, to have Syrian children with German children in school, to have Syrian adults with German adults. And there you can see that for German adults, there are not many opportunities, organized opportunities to learn about the past to become better for the present. So this whole approach is, again, it is something which has a lot to do with German identity and trying to like externalize anti-Semitism on a group. But yeah, there is not so much real thought or respect behind it.
Drawing on the ideas of the writer and Holocaust survivor Jean-Marie, you have suggested that Nazi Germany should be treated like a kind of negative property in history education instead of a negative heritage that Germans of all generations have to reckon with. What do you mean by this? Can you maybe explain it a bit further?
In discourse about dealing with the past or about remembrance culture or including migrants, There is a lot of talk about the National Socialist past as being a negative heritage of the Germans. And this metaphor of heritage is used in a very personalizing way, like as if in every family there has been this dark chapter of history, and this is given to the children and they give it to their children. And there is no abstract way of thinking of society. And you can see now also from this recent development that there is a lot of talk about German colonial past, but nobody talks of the German colonial past in the same way as of the National Socialist past. But still, there is also a lot of negative heritage from this time. And this talk of negative heritage is often said to be a quotation of the writer Jean Amery, who was a survivor of the Holocaust and who wrote some essays about his past. But when you read his essay, you can see that he did not use this term of negative heritage, but of negative property. That those 12 years are a kind of negative property of Germany. And perhaps this is only a small change in the metaphor, but you can rather regard a property of something just being there, like all the impacts of colonial past, they are just being there. All the impacts of Germany having been an imperial country, of having been a feudal country, they are all there still. And it's not like the heritage of certain items. And I think this different metaphor makes it much more easier to think that everybody who is German, who lives here long enough, participates at this property, yeah, because all the families have something to do with our present, which is very much shaped by the past.
And now coming to the last question. What do you think? How can the memory of Nazi crimes be turned into a tool for anti-fascist education? What would an emancipatory and inclusive education at concentration camp memorial sites entail, you think?
If you want an emancipatory pedagogy, you have to define why you are not free and of what you want to free yourself or others. Relating it to anti-fascist and learning about the National Socialist past on sites of commemoration camps. For most of the people for a very long time, it was in itself anti-fascist education, because learning of the past and the crimes and why they were committed was learning about fascism. Fascism as a way of governing a country, of governing people, very authoritarian and from top to bottom. And if you want to emancipate yourself from it, you have to find out what are the residuals of this past. And of course, from an anti-fascist or left-wing point of view, you see that there are a lot of connections between now and the past. And one of them is, of course, that all the decades in Germany, there has been a very big right-wing part of the population. You had Nazis or neo-Nazis. And so the hope is that by learning of the backgrounds, the ideological backgrounds, and the political backgrounds, sociological backgrounds of the Nazi crimes, you understand what the problem is and why you should try to avoid such kind of politics, or understand what freedom of the individual is, and why right-wing politics of our days has to be stopped very early and not when it is too late.
Thank you, Rosa. This has been a very interesting interview, and we really appreciate you taking your time and also giving us some insights to your work and sharing your experience with us. Thanks a lot for this exchange, and I'm very sure the students will really appreciate this. So thanks a lot and take care. Bye.